Hello, my name is Matt Oswald, and this is part 2 of our Contributing to the NRE Labs curriculum series, in which we will use the Antidote CLI to bootstrap a new lesson. So, working with the Antidote CLI is a 3-step process. First, we're going to need to download the Antidote CLI, and there are precompiled binaries that we can just download from the project site. Step 2 is following one of the creation wizards, and we're going to be creating a lesson in this example, although there's other things you can create with the Antidote CLI. So we'll follow through this wizard, and it'll ask us some questions about like what kind of things we want in the lesson and various things like that. Next, once we have a lesson bootstrapped, we're going to run the validation command, which allows us to validate that the curriculum that we have locally, if you remember, we cloned the NRE Labs curriculum in a previous video. We're going to make sure that that new lesson that we've bootstrapped is valid and doesn't have any issues before we move on to the next step. So these are the three steps that we're going to do today. A quick word before we get started. The Antidote CLI is designed to be as easy as possible for new lesson creation, but if you're new to NRE Labs, it can still be pretty complicated. If you're worried about doing the wrong thing, maybe putting the wrong value in the wrong field, don't sweat it. Everything can be fixed later. Just do your best and work forward to a pull request where others can help you out. So if you head on over to the documentation, which is at docs.nrelabs.io, you'll see that there is a link over there to the left that says the Antidote CLI. Go ahead and click that, and you'll navigate to this page, which has a sort of a tabbed view of different commands that you can run based on the platform you're on. I'm running on Ubuntu, so I'll head to this tab, but you can use these other tabs to do basically the same thing. It's all about just getting that binary downloaded and running it locally. So I'll copy these first two commands that basically downloads the tarball and then extracts it, and that should result in the Antidote binaries being made available to us on our system. So I'll copy those. So we're over here in our terminal, and I'm just going to paste those two commands that we saw before. Again, downloading the tarball and then extracting it. And you can see the result of this is that we now actually have 3 binaries. 2 of them you don't have to worry about. These are actually more for just sort of administrators, people who run Antidote-based platforms like NRE Labs. The one we really care about is this Antidote binary, which we can actually run directly if we just type Antidote and then say -h to print some help output. Now, I prefer to work with things just via sort of the native commands, and to do that, we need to have it somewhere on the path. So I'm just going to actually move this into Antidote, then user bin, or rather user local bin. And that way we can just run it like that. Now, you don't have to do that, but I like to do that for convenience. Okay. So the next thing we want to do is we want to access the lesson creation wizard. And you can see sort of in the help output that we have a subcommand that we can run here called lesson. So let's do Antidote lesson, and then we'll type create. What this does is it sort of enters us into this new interactive wizard. And there's links to the docs throughout this wizard. So if you get lost, if you're not sure what something means, there's quite a few options for you. Obviously, you can click on any one of those links that you'll find throughout the output. You can also type question mark at almost any time, and it'll provide you with a little bit more information. So if there's certain constraints on the data that you're able to put in, it'll tell you. It needs to be a string. It's a required field. What is sort of a brief description of what this field is. This is basically like a helper tool that allows you to create the lesson metadata without having to guess at what it means. So let's walk through this wizard. We'll just call this our new lesson. Next is the field slug. Now this is basically a unique identifier. You can kind of think of it as the same thing that you might put into like a blog post URL. That's sort of where that comes from. So we'll just do our-new-lesson. So no spaces, try not to do any uppercases, usually just lowercase alpha with maybe some hyphens in there. Next, we want to select a category for this lesson. Right now, the categories within the platform are fundamentals, tools, and workflows. Again, if you want to know sort of what the difference is between them, go ahead and just head on over to the docs site. But we'll just stick with fundamentals for now because that seems to be what is pretty common. Next, diagram. Now, this is basically an internet accessible image, like a PNG, something like that. We don't want that for now, but we can always put that in later. Again, if you have any questions, you can just hit question mark, and if it's optional, feel free to leave it out. So we'll just leave it out. Same thing with video. It's sort of the same thing. It's sort of an external resource. We'll just leave that out for now. Next, tier. If you have any doubts, just hit prod. The other fields are there really only for this field is really going to be deprecated soon, if I'm being honest. So just go ahead and select prod unless you know what you're doing. Next, collection. Again, this is one of those optional fields. Some of our lessons are part of sort of broader collections that might belong to, say, some sort of an organization or a company. Again, if you have any doubts, just go ahead and leave it out. Description. This is a way for you to really define in a short way what this lesson is all about. So let's put a brief description in here. New lesson. There we go. And then maybe a short description. This would be something like, okay, what is this trying to teach? New lessons. Might be, maybe if you were teaching a lesson on Ansible, then your description would be something like, this is a lesson on Ansible where we learn how to do network automation using the Ansible tool. And then short description would basically just be maybe the word Ansible. The idea here is with short description, you're providing a really like 1 to 2 word answer for what's being taught in the lesson. Description can be a little bit longer and a little bit more verbose. Prereqs. These are really slugs that point to other lessons. So if your lesson depends on other lessons, meaning your lesson covers topics that other lessons already cover in much more fundamental detail, you can go ahead and list those here. We don't have any prereqs, so we can just leave it blank. Same thing with tags. Tags are, again, sort of a categorization mechanism. So we'll just say comma separated list, new lesson, and that way we put it in there. So that's really the first little bit. This is just metadata that describes the lesson, sort of ways of describing sort of where the lesson fits and what it's about. Next, we get into the meat of it. So you'll notice we've kind of gone down a level in the wizard. What this is doing is it's asking us to create a series of stages. And again, if you're not familiar with this terminology, feel free to click the link and get an explanation. This is sort of antidote foo for describing what effectively boils down to things like logical sections or chapters of a lesson. So if your lesson is a book, then you can think of a stage kind of like a chapter. It's a portion of your lesson that covers a very specific topic. So within these stages, we have an opportunity, and we can have a lesson with a single stage or multiple stages, and we'll actually get an opportunity to specify that here in a little bit. But for now, what we're doing is we're specifying the description for the first stage. So stage 0, which is the first stage, give me the description for that. So in this stage, we're going to cover Introduction to a New Lesson. In terms of lesson guides, we have a few options. Again, head on over to the docs if you want to know the details between the two, but we'll stick with Markdown for a default. Next, do we want to provide a video for this stage? Very similar to the video field up here. The only difference is that this is specific to this stage. Some people have different videos for each stage. Some people have videos for the whole lesson. So it really just depends on what you're going for. And of course, if you want, it's optional, so feel free to leave it out. Now, we can provide the answer yes at this point if we would like to loop back and continue to add more stages. But let's say we just wanted to create this lesson as a single stage just for now. So we'll hit no. Next, we need to create a series of endpoints. Endpoints are instances of a software image that we can make available in the lesson. So, for instance, if you need a sort of a container that runs Ansible, is a good example. That would be an endpoint. Maybe a network device, that would be another endpoint. This is where you effectively create references to that software. So, if you want an instance of our utility image running within your lesson, you would describe it here. So we'll name it here. For instance, a common way of describing endpoints is just simply something like, Linux 1, just a simple generic Linux container that's designed to run some commands. You just give it sort of a human readable name. Next, we're going to create the reference to the image. So this is a reference to the actual slug that's used for the image. And if you don't have any, if you're not sure what that's about, the docs sort of go into details on that. But one very common reference for images is utility. This is one of the containers that's maintained by the project that just has a bunch of Python stuff installed, and so you can use that if you'd like. And of course, if you need other software, it's going to be a different reference. But here's where you refer to the actual software image that you would like to make available in your lesson. Okay, next, do you want that endpoint to be automatically configured using one of the configuration options within the platform? You can, of course, select none, meaning no configuration will be done to it, and that's somewhat common for various reasons. Sometimes the image is good enough on its own, but sometimes you want to be able to provide some runtime configuration mechanisms. We're actually going to select Python, and what that means is it says what we're going to need to do as a result is provide a Python script for this endpoint for every stage, actually. And that basically allows us to configure that endpoint at runtime. So the platform will start that endpoint, and then it'll run a Python script that you provide to further configure it so that it's ready for the learner. So we'll provide Python here. Next, additional ports. This is a field that may or may not be necessary based on the next thing that we do. Basically, if you don't have any presentations, you'll need to put something into here, into additional ports. This is basically a way to open up any additional ports that weren't otherwise opened by the creation of presentations, which we'll get into next. We know that we're going to create a presentation for this endpoint, so we'll go ahead and actually skip this. We don't need to provide anything here. And speaking of which, yes, let's create some presentations for this endpoint. You can kind of think of presentations as views into an endpoint. So we have this utility image. We call it Linux 1. It's the name of it at runtime, sort of the host name. We want to be able to present that image, that endpoint rather, to the user, namely through SSH, through a CLI interface. And so we do want to create a presentation. We'll say yes. And this is where we get an opportunity to name it. We'll just name it CLI. Here we provide the port, 22, because we're going to use SSH. And again, this is one of the reasons why we were able to say no additional ports, because if you don't have any presentations, you do need to provide something here. Endpoints that don't have any ports open are kind of pointless. But since we have presentations, we can leave out this field and then provide the ports that we want opened here in the presentations layer. And then finally, we'll select SSH as the presentation type. And that's it. So no more presentations for that endpoint, and no more endpoints. Of course, if you'd like to create more, you certainly can. And then, do you wish to create any connections? We only have a single endpoint, so this actually isn't really needed. But if you wanted to create connections between endpoints, this is where you would get an opportunity to do that. And really, all this would be is sort of a reference between them. So if we had Linux 1 and maybe Linux 2 as an example, you would create a connection and then refer to one and then refer to the other, and that would connect the two at runtime. Now, authors. This is an important field because what this does is it gives you credit for your lesson. There's a field that's actually made available in the web UI to all of the users that describes who you are and what you do. So definitely, I would recommend doing this. So let's select yes. My name is Matt Oswald, so I'll just put in my name. And I'll put a link to my blog. It's as good a link as any. And we'll say no. Okay, this is the last step. So we want to provide a path to the curriculum. Now, if you remember, scrolling up, we are actually inside the NRE Labs curriculum directory now, so we can actually just put dot for the local directory. And what this does, and of course, obviously, if you're in a different directory, please provide the correct directory to the curriculum. But since we were already there, we can just provide the local directory. And what this does at the very end is it actually creates a skeleton lesson for us. And so it creates all of the different metadata files, as well as maybe some starter files. You'll notice that there's a guide.md file in here. There's a few other things. And really what this does is it creates a skeleton lesson. Now, if you look at the warning here below, it's really important to read this because it's actually you're actually not finished here. There's quite a few things that we need to do manually. The big obvious thing is we need to provide the content. So you need to actually add content to the lesson guide here. But there's a bunch of other things that we need to do. And one of the ways that we learn what else needs to be done is by running the antidote validate command. So we'll type antidote validate, and then we'll type dot. And basically what this says is, hey, I want you to validate the curriculum as it stands. So we've created a new lesson directory here in our new lesson. Let me know if the curriculum, after creation of that lesson directory, let me know if the curriculum is still valid. And it is not. So there's a few things we need to do. One of those things is creating a configuration file for our endpoint, Linux 1. Now you remember for the Linux 1 endpoint in the wizard, we actually specified that we wanted to configure it with Python. And the error that we're seeing here for the validate command says, hey, I'm not finding that configuration file. So let's go ahead and create that. If we go to lessons directory, you can see that we have this new directory that says our new lesson, and you'll see we have stage 0. And under configs, we've got nothing. So since we selected Python, we need to create a new Python script. Now the way this works is you have to, the name of the file is very important. The file name needs to be the name of the endpoint that it's designed to target. So in this case, Linux 1. Now since we specified Python, we need to end that with .py. If you were creating an Ansible playbook, for instance, you'd end it with .yml, and if you were using Napalm to configure things like network devices, you'd end it with .txt. But since it's a Python file, we're going to end it with .py. So we can leave it blank for now. Obviously, if you want this to do anything, you would need to edit the Python file to actually do what you want it to do, but we'll save that for a different video. For now, just creation of the file will suffice. So let's rerun the validate command. And as you can see, the lesson is now valid. Last thing to check out would be the metadata file that was created. These are the recorded answers for that wizard that we went through earlier. You can see that we have the different stages, the different endpoints, and all of these different fields that we provided up here. Just do a quick once over and make sure that everything is sort of the way that you expect. Last, and this is certainly not least, you'll want to add your content. So the markdown file here, guide.md underneath stage 0, is where all of the content goes. So if you want to know sort of how to write a good a lesson guide, head on over to docs.nrelabs.io. There's quite a few examples there. Yeah, this is sort of the skeleton version of this. So that's it for now. In the next video, we're going to be contributing this upstream. In the meantime, if you'd like to follow along with the rest of the videos, head on over to the description below or go to our documentation at docs.nrelabs.io. Thank you.